I've been posting up in several of the announcements over the last couple of weeks this aspect of the holy days of the Jewish calendar. Again, these are outlined in the various books of the Pentateuch, such as Exodus and Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. All four of those books have references to these various holy days in the Jewish calendar, and especially those of this time of year, as we have now moved from the new year, per se, Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year, the day of the sounding of the trumpets, which was a couple of weeks ago now, followed by the 10 days of awe, the 10 days of repentance, remorse, and preparing for the great day of atonement. And so that was about a week ago. And then this past Sunday began the week-long festival of Sukkot. Sukkot, again, reminder of God's provision in the wilderness, began on Sunday the 23rd at sundown and will continue until sundown on the 30th. This festival, originally called the Festival of the Ingathering, most of the Jewish holy days have an agricultural origin and agricultural description, such as the Feast of the Harvest, the Feast of the Ingathering. The Feast of the Harvest is a reference to Pentecost, which comes 50 days after Passover. But again, even Passover comes out of the Aramean and Amorite tradition of a springtime offering of sacrifices of the grain harvest, typically barley in the early spring, and the sacrifice of year-old lambs and goats. That was a practice done in the springtime of the people group from which Abraham's family came from. So even Passover does. Pentecost focusing on the conclusion of the grain harvest. So you start out with barley harvest in the early spring, and then around the transition from what we call springtime to summertime is Pentecost, counting 50 days after the Sabbath of Passover. We have Pentecost. The book of Ruth, of course, highlights this in the harvest, and she becomes a model of a person who has come into the faith of Israel, being in the land of the harvest, in the land of Israel, and of course the developing relationship with Boaz taking place in the harvest. And so it's the harvest background. But since, of course, Ruth is the ancestor of David, Davidic messianic hope is something that later gets incorporated into Pentecost, or what we would call the Feast of Weeks, Shavuot. The term Pentecost in Greek is Pentecoste, so that's where we get it's just transliterated as Pentecost into the English language, and it simply means 50th. Pentecoste is 50th, the 50th day after Passover. But again, so you have this bracketing from Passover through Pentecost of the grain harvest season, and of course the harvest of the grain, as well as in the earlier spring, God's provision of the procreation of various animals, particularly of lambs and goats, which were utilized in the Passover sacrifice. And then again, so going on through. The Feast of Booths then highlights again God's provision in the wilderness and his protection of them through that season, even through the 40 years of wilderness wandering after they had rejected the land. So the tradition is to build a sukkah. So you go through an imitation of your forefathers. I talk about in one of my classes on Jewish holy days that they are designed to commemorate and illustrate God's provision in nature and in history. So nature having to do with agricultural production, both of animal husbandry as well as crop production. The fall festival of Sukkot or Booths sometimes called tabernacles, focuses upon the late summer and early fall harvest of various vegetable crops, but particularly the vineyards, and then that which rolls over in later in the fall, the harvest of the olive orchards. So it was a very productive time. And in the festival of Sukkot, around the time of the New Testament and the interbiblical period, they would bring offerings of these fall fruits, such as, and this is a friend of mine in Israel just posted up some pictures of citrons. They look like large, almost like lemons, but lemons that are almost the size of grapefruit, and they're called citrons over there. And these are coming through, and these would be brought as special offerings in this fall harvest season. So again, God's provision in nature and in history, and we remember God's provision, and we live out in an illustrative fashion things the way our forefathers did. So in Passover, you eat the classic bread, wine, Passover lamb, and bitter herbs, as they're outlined in Exodus chapter 12. In Sukkot, you build a hut, a meager outdoor hut, in which your family is to sleep and eat in during this week-long festival season, made with various branches of trees and so forth. I should post up online. I haven't done it yet for this class, but I could post up some pictures I took a number of years back of different sukkahs, Sukkot, in and around the city of Jerusalem. You can do it on a balcony, you can do it on the roof of your apartment complex, or if you're a private homeowner, which is not the norm in Israel today with its growing population and land uses at a premium. But most people live in apartments. You have to have a place for a sukkah if you're a faithful family in modern Israel. But I took some pictures, and I'll post those up on some of the content elements for this course, if you're interested in just kind of looking at some pictures I took about a dozen years ago. So anyhow, so that's Sukkot, the Feast of Booths. It concludes with a special ceremony. Well, actually 2 days of special reminders. One, the 8th day, it's called the Shmini Atzeret, 8th appendage or 8th additional day. And that day is a day for remembering the deceased of the past year. And so there's special synagogue services commemorating Shmini Atzeret. And then that's followed by Simchat Torah. Simchat means joy. Torah of the law, or the Torah, is the day in which the annual cycle of reading through the Torah is completed. So the last readings of the year are done in the synagogue service at the beginning of the service, and then later in the service, after other special recitations and blessings, they begin reading the Torah portions over again. So that each year, like we were said in the Old Testament, that each generation, Deuteronomy 6, and also the reminder in Exodus chapter 12 with regard to Passover, that in every generation you are to tell the story of God's great redemption, God's great provision with your children as you go in and out of the house. Deuteronomy chapter 6, we are to continually tell of God's great handiwork on behalf and through his people, Israel. So Sukkot will be finishing up over the weekend, and followed by Shmini Atzeret and the Simchat Torah. So, reminder of God's redemption from Egypt and the gift of God's infinite wisdom that is revealed in the Torah. Celebration of Sukkot and Simchat Torah.